First task we must undertake here is releasing the wooden base and the metal armature coming out of our sculpture with Vaseline. Be thorough, and I would say use a brush instead of using your hands. The plaster will stick to both, not so much that it will be impossible to get off perhaps, but so much that it's likely going to ruin your wooden board or your plaster mother mold, which of course you don't want. Now, you don't want to ruin the wooden board because it can be used for more sculpture in the future. And as an artist, I think we have an obligation to be cheap and reuse whatever, whenever possible. Mixing plaster is going to be a skill that you need in order for all of this to happen, obviously. Luckily, mixing plaster is not that difficult, though there are some tips and tricks that will ensure you get the same bowl of plaster every time, a good bowl of plaster. And the same bowl of plaster, a good bowl of plaster, is what you should be aiming for. Now, unlike a lot of other materials that we've used in other Patreon tutorials, like resin, plaster has a set mix ratio, or at least that's how we're going to treat it. We should do our best to make sure we don't mess with that mix ratio. So the way to go about it is to fill your container with water, of course. Always water first, powder into the water, never the other way around. Don't fill your bucket or bowl more than halfway full with water, as we'll need to put plaster in there as well, and that will raise the water level. Going over half is going to mean you'll overflow your bowl. The exact amount of plaster that you're going to need for your application is going to be a bit of a guess to begin with, depending on the size of your sculpture and the size of your bowl, of course. Add plaster powder little by little and make sure to sift it into the bowl softly. Don't dump the whole cup in there at once, as this is going to create a dry lump of plaster inside the mix, which we don't want. We want water to penetrate the plaster evenly so we can get an even mix of plaster without the need to mix like crazy. Mixing a lot is going to introduce air bubbles and make the plaster set up faster than we otherwise might expect, none of which are qualities that we are after here. Keep sifting the plaster in until a little island of plaster powder appears on the surface of the water. Try your best to keep this island even across the entire bowl, not just in the middle. You want it right above the water level. The plaster island should be made out of dry white powder to begin with. Once the island is created, we wait for a minute or two, and during this time, the white plaster island should become gray as water seeps into the plaster, soaks into it. The island is going to become gray and the surface will begin to crack and it'll appear like a dry riverbed would. And if you don't know what that looks like, you can Google it. At this point, we will mix our plaster. And ideally, we shouldn't need to mix a lot if we do it this way, because the water will have already soaked into the plaster. Plaster won't begin to set up until you mix it with the water. So there is no rush. You should let the water properly seep into that plaster island before you start mixing. This should provide you with a mix with no lumps of dry plaster in it and as few air bubbles as possible. Never stray from this mixing method. You cannot change the ratio of plaster to water. If you make it too thin, it won't set up, and if you make it too thick, it will have a lot of lumps, air bubbles, and it will set up too fast on you. So, mix the same bowl of plaster every single time and let the natural progression of the plaster as it sets up dictate when and what you do with it. This is the way to mix plaster. First layer is often known as the splash coat, and to me, this step is very important. Many people are going to skip this step, but I think in order to show you how to create a really proper and good mold, we should do this step. And normally I would do this step anyways, but it's possible to skip it, should you feel like living on the edge. The splash coat is brushed on and is meant to capture all the details so the silicone skin and the plaster mother mold registers properly together without any issues. I'm extra careful to get into areas like the 90-degree angles where the silicone skin meets the silicone wall. These are places where we are most likely to capture air bubbles, so we must take extra care here. Depending on the state of your plaster mixture, you might find that the plaster separates from the surface of the silicone like water on oil. And this is normal. Simply move on and let the thin plaster layer dry for a little bit, because it will kind of dry out a little bit faster because it's so thin, and work somewhere else. Then you can go back over the original spot again and make sure the issue with the plaster not wanting to stay and separating is going away. Thin plaster layers will struggle with this issue. They'll separate more than if you apply a slightly thicker layer. And usually what tends to happen is it'll happen the first time you brush plaster on the silicone surface, and then the second time, because now the plaster has a little bit more thickness to it, it'll be able to hold together and not split up like water on oil. Personally, I like to layer my application. I'll go over everywhere once. This part is going to be very thin, but it will cover everything and not be so thin that we can see the color of the silicone through the plaster. Once I've done that, I'll go over everything again, and this is all with the same bowl of plaster, by the way. And the second time I go over the entire piece, the entire mother mold piece, I'm going to try to build up a little bit more thickness. A super thin splash coat is going to be prone to cracking by simply touching it. It can turn to dust underneath your fingers almost. It can also crack during the drying process. Therefore, I try to go back and build up more thickness. When doing this, I can't really brush, since if I do, I'll simply brush off the previous application, which is still wet, by the way. The plaster in my bowl is a little bit thicker at this point because it's progressing from liquid plaster towards hard plaster, and it does so in stages. So it starts out really thin, it becomes a little bit more creamy, then cheesy, then crumbly like a wet cracker, and then it's dry. The plaster in my bowl at this point is thicker, like cream. So the way I do it is I'll grab quite a bit, and instead of brushing, I'll simply let the plaster on my brush touch the surface of my sculpture, but not let the brush touch the surface of my sculpture. This way we can build up thickness without removing or moving anything. I'm kind of tapping it on essentially. And I'm only after a few millimeters of thickness anyways. Working really clean matters as well. I scrape off excess plaster that get over the silicone edge onto the top of the silicone wall. I don't want plaster here, and being able to see this top edge matters, since it means I can register the plaster mother mold piece to the top of the silicone wall. This will give the entire mold a really clean look, and it will work better during casting as well. The surface of the splash coat, as you can see, isn't really that smooth, but it's not that messy either. Too much of a mess here and I'll have a hard time laying my burlap down onto the surface without any air being trapped between the splash coat and the burlap because the surface is so uneven. So we want this layer to be somewhat even, but it doesn't have to be smooth. Let's put it that way. A little bit of a rough surface will help the next step kind of grab onto it as well.